Hey there, welcome to this lecture. In the previous lecture, we have seen how we can write the test cases for our user repository. And we have covered some test cases for our user repository by considering some certain edge cases, as an example, how to create user. And if we are going to create user, then what are the scenarios it may occur? Some of the scenarios it can be a happy path, or some of the scenario it can be handling errors, right? Or how it is behaving while it is encountering some kind of problem, right? So all of these scenarios we have just we need to cover right here. So today in this lecture, we'll be going to cover rest of other test cases for all of the rest of other layers. So let's go ahead to the user service. If you see here in the user service, we have very minimalistic the dependencies we have right now. So for user service, direct dependency is our user repository. So maybe in future there are more dependencies will come as a form of while we are creating the user, then we need to maybe send a kind of notification, right? So in that case, that let's say sending email, that particular mail client, maybe we can accept as a form of dependency. So that is what exactly the solid principle says, right? So without keeping the tight coupling stuff, rather than importing on the top of pile and directly use as a kind of outer dependency, let's try to pass these things from here, right? So that means like we can, while we're going to test our user service, then we can mock that particular sending mail dependency as well as, right? So that's really going to be a kind of very a great way to test it out our code, rather than encountering or rather than touching our actual mail implementation. So let's try to create one file here. So this is the same convention we are going to follow here, the way we followed for our repositories. Let's try to create one directory. This is going to be our __test __, right? So inside this test directory, let's try to create our user service, the test file. This is going to be user.service.test.js. Right? So now you better know how we can write the test cases, right? So in this case, first of all, let's try to import our user service. So this is going to be really going to be necessary, because though we are writing the test cases, the actual implementation always going to be needed, right? So that is the first thing we need to do. So let's try to import that one. We can say import user service from user service.js, right? So don't forget to import the Jest extension. So in my IDE, I have set up something like for TypeScript specific. That's why it is not picking up the JS. So you need to add manually this JS extension right there, right? So service.js. So now let's go ahead and create our describe. So what we are testing it right here, right? So you know better, right? So because this is a kind of user service. So let's try to describe it. So inside this describe, we'll be going to create our mock dependencies, right? So what are the mock dependencies that will be needed? So if you go to the user repository, you can see the similar way we have just a query and repo. So in this case, we'll be going to have our repo and our service, right? So let's try to create that one. So we can say let mock repo. I would say mock user repo, right? Because it has to be specific, right? Rather than saying repo. Let's assume now we are using only if we're going to keep a repo name, all right? Or maybe let's say mock repo. Tomorrow we are going to introduce another repository. Let's say user service need to access the two repository. Then how we will going to do? So this is going to be really a good convention to be precisely specific for that particular file name or what module you are using. So that's why we're saying mock user repo. And similar applies for the service. Let's say let user service, right? So this is perfectly fine, right? Or maybe we can say mock user service. I think this is not mock user service. We are only going to mock our this repository only. That's why we are not using mock here. Then first thing first, let's try to set up our mock repo. So this is what we are going to say before it, and inside before it, we'll be going to set up all of the mock repos. So you can see this is our mock user repo, and mock user repo will be having all of these functions. You can see like we are just to try to mocking it, right? We are not very much care about what we are going to do inside this createUser. Simply that's why we are adding a kind of Jest function here, and getAll user also we are setting a Jest function. And this similar applies for the get user by ID, update user, delete user, find user by email. So all of these things are coming from, if you go to user repository, you can see these are the stuff, right? So let's try to grab all of these things. Let's try to compare it, whether we are doing correct or not. So maybe here we can keep inside comment. And here we can say, right? So this is going to be delete user. Delete user is perfectly fine. Update user is there. Get all user is there. Get user by ID is there, right? Then get user by email, right? So this is going to be get user by email. This is not find by email. Get user by email. And then finally our create user, right? So we have everything. Now let's go ahead and delete all of these things, right? So our user service, like while we are going to run all of the test cases, then every time this is going to be set it right here, right? And our user service will be going to initialize with the mock user repo. All right, so now you can see here we have just created all of the mock functions of the repository, and here we are initializing our user service. So definitely, what we need to do, we need to just like make it capitalized, because we're creating an instance of this user service, right? That is makes sense here. Let's try to put it there. Otherwise, this is going to be assumed from here only, because we have just already declared like this user service, and this name it will going to be consistent. So then this user service will be ended up with some kind of error, right? That is what we don't want. So while we are going to initialize this user service, then it has to pick it up from our actual implementation and along with passing the mock user repository. So now if you go to user service here, all of the functionality, this is going to mimic this particular function, just like create user, it's going to be fulfilled from our mock. So that means rest of all the business logic, it will be going to be the perform accordingly. Now here in the user service, we'll be going to write our rest of use cases, right? So let's try to close the rest of orders. Again, let's try to open user service, and we'll be going to handle the create user. So in this case, we can say describe, right? We can say describe, right? Describe create user, right? So we are just like keeping the same name, just like our function does, right? So this is the one which is called create user, right? Then we'll be going to execute all of these things inside this describe, like this should. And first thing, our user should supposed to be successfully create the user, right? So first thing, while we are going to call this create user function, then it should successfully create the user. That is what the expectation it is, right? So we can say test, right? Test. Then we can say test. Then it should. Then inside test, we are going to say should successfully create a new user, right? So new user. So this is what the expectation it is. So inside this expectation, we'll be going to mock the repository stuff first, right? So let's try to mock that particular thing. We can say cons, right? Because while we are going to call this the user service function, if you go to user service function, then it is returning back the user, right? So user can be anything. It can be like user ID or username, email, something like that. If you go to the create user inside this user repository, let's go to user repository, and we can see like it is creating everything and it is returning back as well, as because we are saying returning everything, right? So that is what we need to fulfill here. So let's try to create a kind of like mock user response, right? So we can say this is going to be something like this. ID will be, let's say 1, right? Name will be John Doe. Then email will be let's say test@.com, right? Then password is not required. Then rest of all, let's say rule will be there. So rule will be, let's say user, right? So these are the minimalistic information is perfectly fine for evaluating this particular use case from our user service. So now let's go to our here, this mock user repo. We can say mock user repo. We can say create user mock result value with this one, right? This is the mock result value that is we are resolving from our create user from the repository. Now let's go to call the actual functionality here, right? We can say const response, response will be await user service dot create user. Right. Then create user is needed some kind of like input, right? Let's try to verify what are the inputs are needed from the create user. So if you go to user service here, right, let's go to user service, then it's required some user data. That is, we have not defined because anyway we are going to cover this validation part, right? So in our user routes. So if you see here, while we are just creating, it is only needed the name, email, and password. So these are the three parameters are required. So let's try to pass it on, right? So here we can say, here, maybe we'll be going to say, name will be John Doe, right? Or maybe what we can do, we can just like, create one input here, input, then email will be same, let's say test at test.com, right? Then password will be something like this, 123. Then here we are going to say, then we are going to say rule will be user. So these are the input, and we can just like keep all of these things right after this. Let's say dot, then we can say input, right? So definitely this password will be, we are going to handle in different way, but let's try to handle this way. Maybe we can just skip the password from the user response also. That is how we can do. Say we're going to say something like this. Let's say mock user repository. We can say name will be input.name, and email will be email, password will be not required, rule will be, let's say rule will be input rule. That's all, right? These are the things are required. Otherwise, we can just directly skip the password from with the help of spread operator, and rest we can use, or other way around it's going to work, right? Then here in the create user, we can directly pass this on. That is called input. Perfect. Now let's try to set our expectation. We can say expect the mock user repo create have call with this input. That is what exactly we need to make sure our user repository, right? Mock user repository create user is calling with this particular input. That has to be confirmed. We need to confirm it. Or maybe we can just like, while we are forming this input, then we can hash this also. That is it will come in later stage, right? So while we're going to handle our any kind of like, hashing library, that is we'll be going to handle a different use case. Now this is perfectly fine in this simple way, just to understand how we are fulfilling our data dependency for our service layer. Now let's try to fill the expectation also. Another expectation, we can say the response will be the mock user response. That is what exactly expected from our this created user, because once we are going to create the user, then it will going to return everything from there. Now let's try to run the test cases, right? So in this case, we'll be going to visit our terminal, and we will say yarn test. Right. Perfect. So it passed all the test cases. So when it ran the test cases, you can see it's picking up the user repository, it's picking up our user service also. That is what it's not the intended result, right? Because we are not interested to run the user repository test. You can imagine if you have a user repository 50 numbers of more than 50 test cases or edge cases, that is going to be like wastage of time every time you are running the user service test. So what we can do, let's go to our terminal once again, like by cleaning up this one. We can say yarn, then test. We can simply what we are going to do. So we can directly drag this particular file here, and we can run the test. Right now we can see it is only picking up this user service test. But this is not looks good, right? So because it's a kind of long whole long pile, and this is the way it's going to be really. This is easy one. You can directly drag and drop, and you can run the test cases. But if you wish to try to keep your terminal clean, or maybe try to run in a different way, you can see while we ran the test cases, it's just picking up this particular path. What is the path exactly? Source, service, test, and user service. Because our running configuration, like Jest configuration, it exists in the package.json file. So that particular package.json file, it can access the file from here, right? Rather than giving the whole path directly dragging up from here. So let's try to do that. So in this case, we can say yarn test, right? Then simply going to provide the source, service, test, all right? Underscore test, and this particular test file name. Now let's try to hit the enter. You can see this is also producing the same result. So this is the way you can directly run the one single file particular test. And you know better how we are only going to consider one test cases as an example. So this time, if you're going to use only, this is not going to work because it has only one test case. That's right, right? So let's try to add rest of all these scenarios. So we have just covered the create user. Maybe you can go ahead and add this is happy path definitely. So maybe you can just add the rest of other the errors or maybe validations and whatever it is handling we are going to handle in our user service. That is, you can handle right here, right? So I'm going to write the rest of other test cases quickly. Then maybe we can discuss together. This is the way we will be able to move it faster. Perfect. So now we have added all of the test cases. You can see we have just added the create user. That is maybe what we can do. Maybe let's try to open side by side, right? So here we'll be going to open our user service. Let's try to open it here. Then you can see the first one will be our user create user. This is already we have covered, right? So though we are going to have only the happy path as of now, so still we are just try to cover all of the test cases. And create user is covered. Then we have our getAll user. So this is the getAll users. And similar applies for the getUserById, so which is potentially needed for perform certain business logic or maybe user profile or something like that. And then update user will be there, where this is the same one, right? So where user can update their information. And delete user also going to be there, which is potentially going to be blocking an user or maybe delete an user from the database. And then finally the user login. So this is where we'll be going to perform some kind of logic. Definitely we will pass some more parameter like password or etc. But that part we'll be going to handle in upcoming lectures. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and run all of the test cases. So let's go to our terminal and we're going to say yarn test, right? So this is the same convention we're going to use to run all of the test cases of user service. Now, perfect. So can you see some of the test cases are passed, but only one test case, it got failed. So why it is? So it says type error user repository find user by email is not a function. So if you see here in the user service, it is referring from this find user by email. This is not a function. So what we are using in the user repository, let's go to our user repository. You can see get user by email we are using right there, right? And similar thing we have covered here also. It says get user by email. So this is the same one, right? Now let's go to our user service. Then here we can just simply gonna say get user by email. So this is the problem exactly often happening with the JavaScript, where you cannot directly validate this stuff. So that's why, can you see, though we are writing the JavaScript and we have some issues in the code, but with the help of test case, you can directly test it out, right? So that's not the thing JavaScript always correct or JavaScript is always the good solution, but definitely TypeScript is it's going to be more readable for the development perspective, right? But at the end of the day, if you are a good programmer and if you are covering all of the test cases something like this way, then you will not fall into trap in the runtime errors, right? So you can you see by writing the test cases, you can catch the errors in early. So as an example, this find user by email, this is something like we don't have any validation here in the JavaScript for finding out the function and all some other stuff. From the implementation perspective, you can see we can catch the error something like this way. So now let's go ahead and try to run the test cases once again. Yarn test, right? Now can you see everything has passed? Cool. So this is the way we can write all of the test cases. So I have already added the happy path. Maybe you can go ahead and cover rest of other test cases also. But as soon as we are going to add more business logic, then our test cases also we need to touch it accordingly. So that is what we will be going to do throughout the whole lectures. Right? Now let's go ahead to the user controller and our routes, because these are the two layers. We need to test it in different ways, right? So let's try to go ahead and I'm going to set up everything. Then I'm going to write the first test case. Then you can maybe continue from right there, right? So that is the thing maybe we can follow here. So let's try to create one directory here inside this controller also. We can say __ test, right? __. Inside this test directory, we'll be going to create similar file, just like user controller .test.js, right? Perfect. So here inside this user controller, again, we will follow the same convention, just like we did for our repository and user service. Let's try to import the controller here, right? This is going to be import user controller, right? From usercontroller.js. So now let's try to describe this test, why we are using this test, right? So we are using this test for describe for user controller. Right? So inside this test suite, what we will be going to do, we will be going to form some dependencies, right? So if you see here in the user service, we have only two dependencies, that is mock user repository and user service. But if you see in the user controller, you can see like we have our user service. This is also going to be needed, and you can see like each and every function will be having this replay. This is also we need to somehow we need to mock it, right? So that is what we are going to form it here. So let's try to do that one. So we can say let mock service, mock user service. Let's say mock user service. Now let's try to use the user controller as well as we are going to say let user controller, right? Then we need to mock one more thing. As I said, let replay. Right. Now let's try to set up all of the mock things right here, right before running the test cases, right? So we can say before each, right? So inside before each, we are going to set up everything. So you can see we have our user service, right? Then let's try to open side by side here. We'll be going to open the user service here. Then you can see like we have our create user, right? Then getAll user, this is the one, and getUserById. Then update user, right? This is the one, another one. Then delete user and user login, right? So all of the functions we have just like mocking on behalf of our user service. Perfect. And finally, we are just like creating our user controller by using this mock dependency, right? And replay is simply just like it's a form of a Fastify function where we are sending the status, right? And we are sending like the send is a kind of another function where we can just like mock it. And this time also we are using Jest. Now let's try to create all of the test cases one by one. The first test case, maybe I'm going to write, rest of all maybe you can write. So here we are going to say describe. So let's go to our user controller. So we are saying the create user, right? So create user will be needed the request and the replay. So these are the two things we need to have, right? So let's go ahead here and we can say describe will be our create user. So inside this describe, let's try to create a test. We're going to say test. We'll be going to say should create our user and send success response, right? This is what exactly the expectation it is, right? So inside this this test case, what we will be going to do, we will be going to form one request here, right? So we can say here we can say const new user, right? So new user. So what we're supporting here while we are just like creating it, right? So you can see the create user, we are passing the new user where we will be going to have our name, email, and password. So these are the stuff we need to just like pick it up from there. So let's try to do that. So new user will be something like this. Email will be, let's say, test.com, right? Then name will be, let's say, name will be test user and password will be our password, right? So this is the new user input. Then let's try to mock our service. We can say mock user service, create user, result new user, right? This is what exactly we're saying from there. Then let's try to form one request. We can say const request, right? Then we're saying body will be there, right? Body will be our new user, right? This is a kind of like we are simply creating this request. You can see this request, right? Now let's try to call our actual function. Here we are going to say await user controller, create user, request and replay, right? So now let's try to set our expectation here. We can say expect mock user service create user, right? It has to call with our new user. So this is what exactly we are saying, like while we are going to call this create user, our user service has to call the mock user service, create user has to call with this new user input. That is what we are saying. And secondly, we are going to say here, we'll say like expected replay status, right? Replay status code will be 201. So that is exactly what we are saying. And another expectation we can also say replace and it have been called with this new user, right? So these are the expectation we can set it there, right? So maybe you can just like add something more, but this is perfectly fine for a while. Now let's go ahead and try to run this test case, right? So if we are facing any kind of error, then we are going to resolve it, right? And if it is not, like if it is successfully going through, then maybe we can just move ahead accordingly. So let's try to go here. Then we are going to say yarn test src. This is perfectly fine. But this time, what we are going to say, instead of service, we'll be going to say controller, and we will be going to say test, then user controller test.js. Perfect. Can you see? Our test is successful, right? So how this test just went through? Let's try to understand. So here you can see, like, we are simply mocking this replay. So that's why we will be going to call this replay, then automatically it's going to be mimic this particular status and this send response. Whatever it is right there, that is, we are going to send it from our, if you're going to call this createUser, if you go to user controller, you can see we're simply returning this replay right there. So that means like already we have a mocking function there, right here inside this the test case, right? Because we have this mock function replay, then this is not going to be call our actual Fastify function. That's not required at all, right? This is already status also going to be taken care by our Jest, and send also it's going to be taken care by our Jest, right? So that is what we are doing right there. And simply what we are doing, we're just like, while we're just gonna create the user, then the user service create user has to call with whatever we are going to pass it this particular request body. That is what we are just to try to evaluate here. Though our user service, the create user, is a kind of not actual function, right? So if you go here in the user service, definitely it's going to be a little bit boring to understand, but still, if you understand clearly, then maybe this is going to be like easy, just like water for you to write all of the test cases. So user service will be having this create user, and it has this particular input. Then rest of all, we are not care about it, right? So whatever the user service is going to do down the line, all of the dependencies, it's user service problem, right? So definitely this is not user service problem. Already that problem we have resolved in our user service test. But we will be going to use the similar structure, right? So that is what we said it here. Mock user service have similar structure, and instead of actual implementation of that particular function, we are simply applying the Jest function to mimic it, right? To resolve or maybe mimic the same behavior that is expected. That is what we did, right? So we are just like mimicking the same behavior. While we are going to create the user, then it has to return some value from there, right? That is what we are setting it up there, right? Maybe you can just like pass it on maybe user ID or email or whatever it's needed, right? That's it. Not necessarily always need to pass the password, or maybe you can pass it on rule or something like that. But and right after calling that actual function, then we are checking it out. It has to call with a new user, then the replace status has to be 201, because if this particular thing is resolved, then user service functionality inside this business logic, then what it will go like, it will always if you go to the user controller here, right? Let's go to user controller. If it is resolved, if it has response data, then it will return successful, right? It will going to return this piece of code, right, along with this response data. So now your homework will be, maybe you can just like mimic this particular thing, right? So you can directly check it out, like maybe instead of this resolve, you can just reject it the way we did for our repository. You can see like where we are just rejecting this database error, right? We are rejecting this one, and that is what you can just like write it right there, right? So if you go to cover this test case, this edge case as an example, we don't have response data, then you can just like resolve that particular thing from our user service, right? I'm gonna say we have errors, we don't have data, then it has to fall into this one. Perfect. So now you know better how to go ahead and write rest of our test cases. Definitely in the very first time, if you're writing test cases, you'll be getting a couple of errors. That's perfectly fine. Trial and error, it can happen, but it will going to kind of give you a good experience to deal with this kind of problem and solving the issues. So now let's go ahead and write the next test case for our routes, right? Then we are done for this particular week, and the next week then we are going to handle some different scenarios. So now here we'll be going to create another directory. We're going to say again test underscore underscore. So here inside this user routes, let's try to create one more file inside this test directory. So here we are going to say user routes dot test dot Jest. Right. And similar, we are going to apply just like we did for our user service and repository. All right. So let's try to import actual file here. This is going to be import user routes from user routes.js. Right. Now let's try to describe this test file. Right. Describe will be definitely our user routes. Right. And inside this test suite file. So inside this test suite, we need to form our dependency. So there are two major dependencies will be needed in this case. So if you go to the user routes, you can see like, all right, so here inside this user route, you can see we are using Fastify, right? So Fastify can have all of the functions, just like, post, get, patch, delete, all right? So all of these things we need to mimic. And along with our options as well as where we are going to have the access of the controller, right? So that is what we are going to do. So let's try to do one by one. So here inside this user routes, let's try to form our Fastify dependencies. In this case, you can say mock, or we can say const mock Fastify dependency, or maybe we can say mock Fastify also. It's gonna work. And inside this mock Fastify object, we'll be going to say get Jest function, post will be Jest function, patch will be there, and delete will be there. That's all, right? Then another one will be our controller. We can say const mock controller, right? Inside this mock controller, we'll be going to mimic all of the functions. So let's try to validate like whether we have the correct functions we are mocking or not. So here maybe we can open side by side, and instead of this one, we will be going to say the controller, user controller. Let's try to drag it and put it here. And you can see this is the createUser. We have the getAll users. That is also we have getUserById, update user, right? Then delete user and user login. Everything we have here, right? That is perfect. So now let's try to set up our before each. But this time we will be going to use the before each in a different way. So in earlier we did like we have set up everything inside the before each. But you can see right now we are not setting up the before each every time because we can have tons of routes, right? So that's why we're just like putting this thing. It will be set it on the outside of that particular before each, right? Then in before each, we will try to clear all of the mocks. That is what we are going to do, right? Because already we are forming right here, then we'll be going to set the expectation inside this one single, let's say every test case. And but right after running the test case, we need to just like reset the mocks, because that is the way some of the third parties are going to work, right? So let's try to do that. So in this case, we are going to say again describe, right? Describe, and this time it will be just like user registration, right? And our first test will be, as a happy path, we can say test, right? Test. We can say should register, should call register user register route, right? So this is what our expectation it is, right? So maybe we can just like add some more description, like what exactly this particular test case is for. But let's try to keep it like this way. Maybe I'm not be able to find a kind of a good description, but definitely you can just like go ahead and write it at your convenience, whatever suits at you. So first of all, let's try to set up our route here. We're going to say await user routes, mock Fastify, and mock user controller. So this is not going to be mock user controller. We need to say controller user controller. User controller will be our mock controller, right? So this is going to be async again, right? So you might have asking like why we just like keep it this way. And if you see in the user routes, you can see we are keeping our user controller inside the options. Like options will be a kind of object. It can have some more dependencies. That's why we need to use something like this. Perfect. Now let's try to set our expectation here. Expectation will be simply it's very simple. We'll be going to try to check like whether while our registration endpoint is getting called, then it has to tie up with our mock controller use getAll users also. That is what the expectation it is. So let's try to check it out. We are going to say expect, right? Mock Fastify, then we can say post, right? It has to be a kind of post call. Then we can say to have been called with, right? To have been called with, right? We can say endpoint will be users, right? This is what we are using for registration, right? So maybe we can just like change it to register, but as of now, let's be that as it may, right? Then after that, we need to provide like which function exactly it's going to be tied up, like while it's going to call it have been called like the user registration endpoint. Then definitely our mock controller will going to be take care of the create user, right? This is what exactly it has to be tied up with the user. This is the expectation. So let's try to run the test case. We will see like whether we have any kind of issues or not, right? So if we have any issues, then we will check it out like that way. And here maybe what we are it's going to be automatically. So here it is imported automatically. Let's try to remove this one that is not required. Now let's try to run this test case, right? Let's go to our console. Here we can say yarn test, right? Source C. Then this time it's going to be routes, right? Routes. Then we can say test, and we can say user routes.test.js. Let's try to run the test case. Cool. So it seems like it has some issues. So what is the issues? Can you see like we just try to run the test case, but we haven't mentioned like what is the schema exactly, because can you see like the schema validation already we put it right there, right? So this schema we need to add somehow right there, right? So let's try to maybe move to a different directory, right? So here we can say routes. Let's try to create one directory here. This is going to be schema, or right schema. I know this is not the right place, but as of now, let's try to accommodate. Maybe we are going to move the schema some other safe places. So what we'll be going to do, let's try to put that particular thing to schema from here to this schema file. You can say user or register schema, user register.schema.js, right? So here you can say export. It will be export const user register schema. Perfect. So this is the thing we are going to use right there, right? So now let's go ahead here and we can say here user register schema. Cool. Then the similar applies for the user routes also. Here we will be going to say right after this we'll say user routes, not user routes exactly. It's going to be user register schema, right? Perfect. So now let's try to run the test case once again. We're going to say yarn test, right? Cool. Can you see the test case is passed? Perfect. So now you know like how we can test our endpoint. So we are writing the test cases for the routes is only just like try to validate whether our user route having all of the endpoints or not, right? And whether while we are going to call this endpoints, then do we have the proper validation, proper data inputs on the right platform? Maybe in upcoming lectures, we'll be going to do end-to-end test also, but that is not in the monolithic part. It's already included in our microservice part. Cool. Then so far, what we learned here, we can just like refactor our code to clean architecture and using the solid principle just to make sure like we have all of the functions has a single responsibility. One particular layer is doing like an only single thing, right? It is only responsible for certain business logic or certain kind of the functionality. And dependencies are make sure like it has to be loosely coupled, so you can pass it any kind of dependency. It can be actual implementation or it can be a kind of test implementation. And one more thing we need to check, like each and every layer has to be testable. As a very simple example, you can say our routes are testable, right? And our repository testable, our controllers are testable, and eventually our service also testable. Even if you are writing any kind of utilities or any kind of other packages, each and everything has to be testable. That is the basic rule of like writing good code, right? So now let's try to run all of the test cases together. We can say yarn test, right? Can you see all of the tests are passed? Perfect. So that's all for this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll be going to set up our CI/CD. So where we'll be going to create one Git repository, and we will push our code to our repository, and where we will set up like continuous integrations right there, right? So where we will test it out right after, like, all of the test cases has to be seamlessly run in our CI server. Then while it comes to completion of the project, then we'll be going to handle our continuous delivery as well, as where we will be going to write all of the migration stuff and correct way, and we can, as soon as we are pushing our code to the GitHub or maybe any form of version control, then it should have to be deployed successfully in our cloud. It can be maybe Fargate, it can be AWS environment with the help of EKS or maybe GCP, anything. Cool. Then see you in the next lecture in the next week.